What would it feel like to have 14 million eyeballs? Actually, 14 million times two, because every viewer that Andrew had on his TEDx was times two, and glasses, right? Math wise, you're kind of a nerd, a self-proclaimed nerd. 14 million times people with glasses, because you probably attract the nerdy type of humorist too, don't you?
Yeah. That's true. That'd be 56 million views, but we'll count just the 14 million, even if it is just one view. In terms of what YouTube says, it's 14 million. We'll count that.
What does it feel like? Your daughter's only 3, but does your daughter like know that you're a rock star in the humor field? Does she laugh at your jokes still?
She doesn't. She doesn't get my puns yet at 3.5. No. She loves a good, a game of hide and seek. But wordplay, not her specialty quite yet. I'm working on it though. Working on the dad jokes.
Some people are dad. You were just born to be a dad. No, when you were a kid, were people like, you're just destined to become a dad with that kind of humor, bro?
Exactly. They're just like, wait for you're supposed to wait for this. I was like, no, I'm practicing. I may not be good at emotional intelligence and being there for my child, but I am going to be good at jokes. That's what I decided at age 5.
If there was ever, America has contests for everything. Like Europeans are horrified at this like hot dog eating contest, as though that's a sport, right? They should have funniest dad pun joke contests.
There are world pun championships.
Oh no, there are.
Yeah, I've never I competed in like a regional version of it, and I lost in the finals, of which I'm still very upset. But there are actual like world championships of punning, and it is the lowest form of contest, if you believe the lowest form of wit. But it's a lot of fun.
It's the lowest form. So when we do improv, everyone who's watching, I met Andrew pretty much at the beach in California at an Applied Improv Network. It wasn't Tinder. It was just like our party on Saturday night at the world's best conferences. And he was on stage earlier that day. And this guy has combined like improv with humor, with stand-up, with corporate training to have the most impressive career I've seen in our improv field. And you don't even focus on that anymore, right? You've just made it so big and you're so humble. And so I guess that's the humor part. Humor makes people relatable, right? You could be arrogant, but then, right?
Arrogant people are very rarely funny. And I think that's you're probably stumbling on or kind of suggesting one of the big, benefits of humor. Because this is one of the things, like, so in my bio, when people introduce me, I want them to know that I have a TEDx talk with 14 million views. Yeah. I want them to know that. But I don't want to sound like I'm gloating about it or anything like that, because that's not it's really kind of luck on my part. But what we say is, I have, and it has a TEDx talk with more than 14 million views, only half of which from his mother. So by adding just a little bit of humor, you're like, okay, you're bragging a little bit, but I'll accept it because you made me laugh too.
Beautiful. So I was going to ask you, when people come up to me and they're like, you're so funny, Jessica. I'm like, really? I was the ugly sister. So I had to develop something to get a little attention from someone. And I'm glad that it turns out that I make you laugh. But they want to know how they can become funnier. And I'm always like, well, there are rules to it. And some people are born naturally funnier, and some people see things more observational. And there's these like different types of humor. But the self-deprecating one is almost the go-to that I say for beginners. Would you agree that you can build credibility and likability within the first couple sentences of a speech?
For sure. I mean, you can absolutely build likability, credibility within a speech, or even within an introduction at a networking event, et cetera. And that's one of the things that's nice about humor, is it's a way to create kind of instant rapport with people. Because if you get someone to laugh or smile, it's kind of like you're saying that you're on the same side of something. So you get people bought in. And self-deprecating humor can be a great form. There are some watch outs for it. But there are some, like, it's a great way. Anytime you're in a high status position, which if you are speaking, you're by default in a high status position because you have a microphone and people are looking at you and you are theoretically at least commanding a room. And so you can use a little bit of self-deprecating humor to say, hey, I don't take myself too seriously, to reduce those status differentials a little bit, to be a little bit more accessible. And so it's a great technique. There are, like I said, some watch outs for it. So you just got to make sure you don't use it too often, basically.
Yeah. So because you want to, well, people tell me all the time, they're like, You're not getting hired, girl, because you act too funny and too clowny. So could you tell me which is the right type of humor out of the 7 personas that you like to talk about that is best for professional settings? And can you actually change the one you were kind of born with? Like, is that switchable if you want?
It is. Well, the whole premise of the TEDx talk, which I think the reason why 14 million people have watched it, is that the idea is that humor is a skill, which means that it can be learned, right? And so the talk is talking about the skill of humor, the things that we can kind of pick up. Just like you can learn a new language, or you can learn how to cook, or you can learn how to play the piano. You may not ever become world class at any of those things, but you can for sure get better. And humor is the same way, right? Like, I'm not going to guarantee someone that I can teach them how to be so funny they're going to have a Netflix comedy special, but I can't help you learn to be funnier. Like, whatever your baseline is now, we can improve it. And one of the ways that we do that is, you know, if the idea is that humor is a skill and it can be learned, then the question isn't, are you funny, but what kind of funny are you? And so in our research, we discovered that there's roughly 7 ways that people tend to express their humor, the different 7 humor personas that you're kind of alluding to. And so just very high level, quickly, they are the enthusiasts, which are people who like find joy and positivity in the world around them. You have curators. These are people who aren't funny necessarily themselves, but if they see a funny meme, they immediately think of 3 people that they want to share it with. Like, oh, so-and-so would love this, right? So you can take other people's humor and curate it for different kind of contexts and scenarios. You have the inventor. These are people who sit down and write, and they understand the science of comedy, of things like a comic triple or the rule of 9 or other things. You have an entertainer. These are people who get up on stage. You have the advocate or the engineer, who is someone who uses humor to solve problems. And you have the advocate. This is someone who creates a space for other people to shine. Applied improvisers are a lot of times advocates, because they're like, hey, I'm not going to be the funny person. I'm going to get you up on stage and you're going to do a quick activity. And now you're going to make the entire room or audience laugh. And then finally, you have the skeptic. And skeptics are people who are unsure of the benefits of humor, or they're at least aware that there are some dangers to humor. And so to your question of which one is the best for the workplace, it kind of depends, right? There's pros and cons to each of them. And what we recommend for people is to start with the one that's most natural to you, knowing that you can learn the other ones later, right? So by virtue of you doing a lot of speaking and performing and improv, there's a component of you that is for sure an entertainer, right? Someone who can get up on stage and make people laugh or think or smile because of your stories, or because of your wit, or because of how you're interacting with people. And so that's a great persona to have.
So you, as we went over before, you were kind of born with dad pun jokes, and you will probably die with a pun on your tombstone. If I told you, I want you to become like that kind of funny, could you do that? Or it's just not natural? It's like some people like tall, blonde, blue-eyed people to date, and other people like dark, strong, and really short Latinos, right? But can you change this about yourself?
You can. You can learn the other styles, and then the goal for us, what we train people for, is one, to tap into what you do naturally, but then over time learn the other skills so that you can be the different personas at different points, right? Because it's great to be an entertainer. It's great to be that person that's kind of the life of the party, center of attention type thing when you're on stage. But that can become too much if you're now one-on-one with an individual person and you're having a very serious conversation. And you're like, no, tone it down. That's where sometimes people are like, don't be the clown, be like a little bit more serious, more summer, right? Like, and so part of the skill of humor is knowing what humor is appropriate at different times. And so you can learn the other ones. The nice thing is you can take whatever your natural persona is and use that to learn the other ones. So for example, a lot of people are curators. It's probably one of the most popular kind of personas that we see. We have an assessment and over 10,000 people have taken it. And one of the most popular kind of personas is a curator, because it's what we do naturally day to day, right? We're constantly on social media. We see a funny meme and we think of someone like, oh, our friend is going to love that, so we're going to send that to them. Well, that's a great persona to start with, because you don't have to be funny. So if you want to add more humor to your presentations, one thing that you can do is start to curate more images or more funny things from other resources in your presentation. So you don't have to be the funny one, but you then point to a slide and boom, it kind of makes a point for you. But being a good curator, you don't realize it, but what you're doing over time is you are learning the skills. You're learning like, okay, what made this made me laugh? If I start looking at a bunch of puns to curate for other people, I could actually start to learn what a good pun looks like, right? It's almost like generative AI in our brains of like, you feed it a bunch of data, take that additional step to analyze just a little bit, and suddenly you're learning.
Okay. I like this because that is the easiest way for them to realize what is funny. And what I notice is when I teach them the simple rule, maybe from your experience, I often ask people in the workshops, like, why do people laugh? And within a couple of seconds answers, people get to the unexpected. Yeah. And for me, I just say, you don't have to become funnier. You just have to become more unexpected. Just say something that's not as expected, and humans delight in surprise and will laugh. Won't be the funniest thing on earth, but is that a type of humor, or is that essentially what humor is? It's
a little bit of both. So there are kind of 4 prevailing theories as to why humans laugh. And so one of them is called incongruity theory or surprise theory, which is essentially that people laugh when they are surprised, right? And it's a little bit of a function of kind of evolution and how we are raised. The problem is with that particular theory is that there are plenty of things that are surprising that aren't necessarily funny, right? And so that's where, like, if all you ever do is the unexpected and there's not necessarily intention behind it, that's where people might see like, oh, that person's a little bit of a clown, or that person is just strange, right? It's just a little weird, which can also be its own positive if you want, but that's the danger. There's a theory called the benign violation theory, put together by Peter McGraw, or at least heavily researched by Peter McGraw. He wrote a book called The Humor Code. And essentially the benign violation theory is kind of an evolution of incongruity theory, where benign violation says that we find something funny when we perceive there to be a violation of some sort, such as a surprise. Or like schadenfreude is an example of benign violation, because a violation is someone else gets hurt, but it's benign because it wasn't me. Right. Or to me, it's kind of like, I think it's a Mel Brooks quote that says, tragedy is I cut my finger. Comedy is you fall into a sewer and die. Right. Like the violation is someone falling into a sewer. That's not so good, but it's benign because it's not me and it's a random stranger and kind of it's extreme. Right. And so, so benign violation is is one theory as to why we laugh. What I found interesting both about the book, The Humor Code by Peter McGraw, is that he did all this research, went to all these different countries, and then he did some stand-up comedy in the book, and he didn't do particularly well. And I found it fascinating that it's like, you don't have to know the theories of comedy or humor at all to be a funny person. Like, it's interesting for us to dissect and understand, but you don't actually need it if your end result or end goal is to be funnier, is to be more interesting. So all that to say, the surprise component of it is absolutely a form of humor that you can use. And then we can mold that a little bit better to have the type of result or payoff that we want, right? So for example, a basic joke creates surprise because it creates a setup and a punchline, right? Basic joke structure is a setup and a punchline. And the setup creates a certain expectation or idea, and then the punchline is a surprise. Like it breaks that expectation in some way. So a great joke that I like it's George Burns, and he says that happiness is having a caring, close-knit family in another city.
Nice.
Right? Which is great. But that joke only works because in another city is at the end. If you said happiness is having a family in another city who is caring and close-knit, doesn't really work as well as a joke. And so one thing that we can learn, back to your point of like, can you learn to do dad jokes? Can you learn that style? Can you become what we call the inventor persona? Absolutely. You just have to learn the structure of things like setup and punchline.
Now, when I was in Germany, I did a workshop on humor to like 35 Germans. I've never received so few laughs. My average is like 38% laughs in an hour workshop, right? I was like down to like 12.2. And the Germans loved it. Afterwards, they told me they loved it, but they're either laughing inside, or our humor is so different, or they don't have humor. What do you say about the humor in Germany?
Well, I am a uniquely, I don't know if I'd say qualified, but I have a unique perspective on this, and that my wife is German.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And she is, I joke that she's the first German person that I've ever dated, and it's the most efficient relationship that I have ever been in. It is wonderful. But one, my wife has an incredible sense of humor, right? She's laughing constantly. She is also an incredible source of humor for me as a comedian and speaker. I have a number of stories kind of about her. And so what I would say is that I have never met a single person without a sense of humor. I have met plenty of people who have a very specific sense of humor. And I have met a lot of people that don't necessarily agree that where humor is and isn't appropriate. Because if you go to Oktoberfest, which is in September, in Germany, though, you're going to find a tremendous amount of laughter. You're going to find a tremendous amount of like jovial spirits, etc. You're going to find a whole lot of alcohol along with it, right? But it's like it depends on the context. Similarly, in some of the work that we've done in Asia, some groups there they have great senses of humor, but then feel like they've got to be incredibly professional and incredibly, I'll put professional in quotes there, but they feel like they have to be incredibly like almost robotic in the workplace. And so it depends on the culture, depends on the group, but everyone that I've ever met has had a sense of humor. It's a matter of finding it. Germans, I feel like, at least in my own personal experience, I've done a number of events in Germany. They find humor in pointing out the inefficiencies, so long as you're going to like solve the inefficiency later. And then also poking fun at some of the ridiculousness of me being, from the US, etc. But those things have certainly made people laugh.
Okay. So speaking of Asian culture, I met Wayne when I was in Singapore just a month ago on our way to the GSS, the Global Speaking Summit. And I was saying, hey, you must use humor because you have this like warmth and this jovialness. And he's like, no, it's in the professional setting, it's best to keep it more serious. And I thought, oh, well, that's not my place in Asia. Then I thought maybe I had a chance over there. So Wayne is asking you, what are some of the things that you do that keep you in like funny shape?
Funny shape. It's a great question. I mean, like any skill, you've got to practice it, right? Consistency is key. And there's a couple of easy ways, I think, to practice. One of the easiest is to keep what humorists or people call a humor notebook. So a repository, a place where anytime you have like kind of a funny idea or interesting thought, you kind of write it down. So comedians have this all the time. If you do stand-up, you always have a notebook or your notepad or voice notes or something with you, because if you're thinking through something, you're like, oh, that's an interesting way of playing with something. Let me write that down. Or a crazy thing happens to you, write it down. Or you say something in conversation that you just came up with on the spot, but it made people laugh. You could go back a little bit later and write that down and be like, oh, what was it about that? And that process does two things. First of all, it helps you remember the funny or interesting ideas that you had. There's a great Mitch Hedberg joke that is kind of along the lines of, sometimes late at night, I'll think of a really funny joke. And if the pen is too far away, I either have to like get up or convince myself that the joke isn't funny. Right? Like, it's like, oh, I got to like find that balance, because you're like, oh, it's so funny. I'll always remember it. And the very next day, you might remember that you had a funny idea. You might remember where you were standing when you had that fun. You might even remember how the wind was blowing during that funny idea, but you won't be able to like necessarily like capture it like specifically in your head. So the humor notebook helps you remember. So then if you're like, hey, if you're going to do a presentation and you're like, oh, well, I want to add a little bit of humor, what could I do? You can go back to the humor notebook as kind of a resource. But more importantly than that is that having a notebook starts to change how you see the things that happen to you. Because it's not that funny things happen to funny people. It's that funny people see the things that happen to them in a funny way. And so by having the fact that you're like, oh, I'm going to write that down, you go through the world and something happens to you and you're like, oh, okay, that could be interesting. I'm going to start to notice those things a little bit more, right? Whether it is an observation or an interaction or why is it this way? Like I'm trying to learn Spanish right now because we're spending a lot of time in Panama for my wife's work. And just by the sheer virtue of me learning a new language, I'm noticing, one, all the intricacies of Spanish, but also of English, of things that I never like recognized or realized before. Like some of like learning German, or like my wife will sometimes use these ridiculous like German expressions. Like there's a German expression that equates to essentially like, well, now we've had the salad. which means like things have like gone awry or something. And it's like,
Oh,
what does that even? And I'm like, that's a ridiculous expression. And she's like, what about your ridiculous expressions? Like we have an expression, like it's so easy, like taking candy from a baby. Like,
that would make sense, woman.
Why would you do that though? Like, why are
It's
you stealing
easy.
from a baby? And do you know how strong babies' grips are? Why are you around babies anyway? Right. So there's all, but anyway, like it's changing my perception. So we are influenced by what we see and also what we look for. So the number one habit I would say is keeping that humor notebook, and you'll immediately start to notice more things and create it as part of the process.
Love it. No one else had any more questions. So in Europe, it's quite well known that the Northerners, the Northern Westerners, the British Isles people, they're the funniest people. And it's kind of like understood that that's that. And then when I started analyzing humor, I realized it's because they're very sharp, right? They're fast. Yeah. They're like intelligent humor. Whereas if you go like down where I live in Barcelona, it's known as like poopy humor. Right? There's a lot of statues of guys taking a crap, like Trump taking a crap. That's hilarious. And we Canadians and Americans don't really laugh at that so much. We have our own style of that as well. But I don't get the British humor. It's too above me, right? So I'm stuck a little bit in between being like, I'm German, but I'm not smart enough to like get the Brits, and I have my own, so I have this own little style, and I don't really love the other personas. It's like, I really have to force myself to try and do that. And one of the things I say is like the best type of humor is yours. Like if you're just starting out and you're scared, you're going to look like an idiot. Well, go with the one that brings you joy. Because when you walk on stage, right, and you're laughing and you're like, my wife would have loved that salad joke, but nobody else laughs. People laugh with you because you're enjoying yourself. So am I on track by advising people this?
Absolutely. I mean, I've done over 1,800 performances all around the world in 35 countries, I think, at this point. There has been one person that has been in every single audience.
You.
Me.
Oh, I was like, who? You have a stalker?
I have a stalker. Yeah. My mom has been probably in the highest percentage of them, followed then by my wife. But I have been in every single audience.
Yeah.
All 1,800 of them. So I better find myself amusing. And what really kind of crystallizes that is if you go and look at my TEDx talk, 14 million views. In fact, I think it actually just recently peaked to 15 million views.
Wow.
That's a lot of people that I don't think people hate watched it. Like I think a lot of people did enjoy it. But if you read the comments, there are a ton that are like, this was great. I really enjoyed it. I love this joke. This was funny. His grandmother is amazing, etc. But there are also plenty of other ones like, this guy isn't funny. This was terrible. He's copied a lot from other comedians. I do like in one of the comments, though, someone was like, he's copied a lot from other comedians. And the guy below him was like, I thought he was pretty okay. I appreciate that. Yeah. But do that for any video. Do that for a popular video of Saturday Night Live. Pick your favorite stand-up comedian, go and look at the comments, etc. And essentially, you're going to see people who love it and people who hate it. And if you're never going to please everyone, then why not start with pleasing yourself? Why not just have so much fun? And so to your point, if audiences, two things will happen. One, you're going to have a whole bunch of fun. Two, the audience will start to enjoy you having fun. And the third bonus thing that will happen, particularly in the age of the internet, is that you'll start to find your tribe. Humor is such a specific thing that it's just like, when they talk about from a business perspective, niching down, etc. It's like, no, humor is a way that you can connect. And so if you vibe with my nerdy type of humor, great, come and get more of it. If you despise what I'm saying right now, luckily on the internet, you can just say goodbye. You don't have to connect with me on social media, etc. This can be the last that you ever hear this nerdy voice, and we're both going to be okay.
That's beautiful and humble. And that's the whole point of why humor works so well, because it puts a new perspective on reality. Some people don't like us. And what we do about that? Well, not much. We can't change ourselves. So I think humor is the most healing. Well, I healed pretty much all of my trauma through clown classes. And I learned to like myself through improv classes. So for me, without those two things, I'd be a disaster.
Exactly. And I learned, I think one of the things that is, helpful, hopefully, and part of the reason why the TEDx talk resonated, et cetera, is that I'm not a naturally funny person. right? I am not the person that was like, oh, like when people find out that I do stand-up comedy, like especially when people that I went to school with, when they found out that I did stand-up comedy, they're like, but you're not funny. Even today, like I'll be the keynote speaker at an event. And if I'm like later in the day and I'm sitting there observing stuff, like I was doing an after dinner keynote speech not too long ago. And I was sitting at one of the tables kind of chatting with people, and I'm more of an introvert. So I was like, I'm cordial and say nice things, etc., but allow other people to talk. Then they announced the speaker. I went up and spoke, went really, really well, and then came back down. And all the people were like, we had no idea you were the speaker. You were like, but you weren't like making us laugh at the table. And it's like, no, that's not my, I'm not super jovial conversation wise. I can be if I need to turn it on, but also I'm here at the table. I'm not trying to entertain you. I'm like, you all have a good conversation, right? You're networking with each other is important. And so I think it's important for people to recognize that, there's a skill that you can learn and a moment for each of these things, but very similar to you, at least in the sense of like comedy, stand up and improv gave me more confidence. It gave me the ability to like feel like my ideas were worthy of being shared because I could get people to laugh. So I think what we're both speaking to is that humor is way more broad than just, hey, I get to make people laugh. Like, no, it can transform your work and your life.
Humor that works. I heard it's a good book.
Love it. That's a great plug. That is great.
That's Andrew's book, guys. His name is Andrew in Print and Drew by Voice. So
in conversation.
Drew, I have one more question from my friend Tor. He asked, how do you use humor with topics like mental illness? It's getting worse around the world, or better, who knows? Depends if you're optimistic. How do you talk about it without making people cringe and running away and pretending that doesn't exist?
It's a great question, and it's one that we work a lot with in our coaching programs, more on how do you add humor to topics and programs and things like that. And so some of the people that we work with are have very serious topics. And I think there's two things to understand when using humor in that situation. One is recognizing that humor is really still valuable. Humor doesn't necessarily mean that you discount completely the service. In fact, by adding some humor into your programs, what you can do is, one, you can relieve stress that the audience may have. You can release tension that people might have about a particular subject matter or things like that. The other thing that you can do is if you do a program and everything in it is somber, then people don't know what's more important and what's not. Just as like when I first started speaking, all of my programs were just about being funny. And so people are like, oh, this was an interesting talk, but it's not that important to my work. Right. Okay. And once I started introducing more of these moments where we're laughing, and okay, now we're actually pretty serious for a moment, that delta change in emotion has more of an impact. Same thing on a serious topic. If you can be like, hey, we're somber a little bit, now let's laugh a little bit, now let's come back down. And now that emotional change, if you follow Nancy Duarte and kind of what resonates in a speech, that cycle is what's going to make your presentation more memorable. Now, how do you actually do that? Well, one of the techniques that I think is what I would start with is associations. And so associations like a metaphor or a simile or a connection allows you to talk about a serious subject, connect it to something that's less serious, make fun of the thing that's less serious, and then still keep this subject matter really important. So case in point, we were working with someone who was talking about suicide prevention in teens. And obviously that's a very serious subject. That's not one that you want to just kind of like hoity-toity joke about the whole time. And so they already had this analogy about getting on and off the bus, right? So they had this analogy about this bus. And so he said, okay, so what you can do is you can make a little bit of humor about riding buses, right? You can talk a little bit about, so you can set things up of like, so in some ways it's a little bit like a bus. Like you all know the experience of riding a bus, and then boom, a couple of jokes or observational experiences or stories about riding the bus and kind of how tough it can be or how interesting it can be or waiting for like delays or what, make all of this stuff funny. And then when you bring it back, it's like, well, actually, it's a lot like this challenge that we're dealing with, this epidemic of teen suicide. And so now I've made people laugh here, but now I'm bringing it back to something a little bit more serious, and I'm not poking fun at teen suicide. We've already had laughs over here. Now we can be somber again. But this connection, this metaphor helps people to remember things a little bit longer. Why were they talking about that bus so much? That was that really funny story. I remember laughing about that. Oh, right, because it actually connected in these ways. So association can be a really powerful way if something is important. I think the other thing is starting with a little bit of humor and potentially ending with it, right? Storytelling is a great way to do that. Stories about yourself, right? Where you can poke fun. Again, self-deprecating humor can be a great way to kind of get some laughs from there as well. But I think the most important thing to recognize is just because the subject matter is serious doesn't mean that it can't be joked about or that we can't use humor around it.
And my last irritation, I'm sorry we went over the 20 minutes, but I can't help it. If I get someone famous like you online, I can't keep my commitments.
I love it. Well, on the fame point, I will say one of the funniest jokes apparently to my wife is I was having a conversation with someone and they're like, oh, I feel like I'm talking to someone famous. And so I told that to my wife a little bit later and she laughed for like 10 minutes straight about like, you fame what? So that's the thing. It's like being the person at home. It's like, I've heard all those jokes before. I've heard it many times. Not very funny. But yes, of course, I'm happy. This is a subject matter that I'm incredibly passionate about. So I'm happy to talk further about it.
Yeah, well, it was so inspiring to see up to 15 million views on your humor topic on TEDx, because ideas that need spreading. And you and I are in this industry. We have thousands of colleagues in the humor, the improv, the clown world, the stand-up world. And we all believe in this so much because we know how it changed our lives. But say that to a person who's scared to look like an idiot, scared to not get laughed with, and they go the safe route and they go, I'm a serious professional. I'll give great content and good stories, but I won't go for the humor. And it kind of breaks my heart because it's so powerful. And they're missing that because of being afraid of being not funny. So for me, do you have a message? Because I've been trying to say it, but I'm just one girl with, I just did a TEDx talk in Pakistan. We'll see how many views my TEDx gets.
Nice.
It's not my name right. That's pretty much my success so far. And I have a double chin in the picture. That's another success. Oh no, it's just still down.
The poster came out.
Oh, that looks good though. Nice clean background. What do you say to professionals who come to my things and they're like, I'm just not funny. I'm a more serious person. And I don't want to be not taken seriously, because serious means professional and funny means clown. You get paid here and you get fired here. What can I say to these?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, it's recognizing that at some point we conflated this idea that, being a professional means having to be serious, right? Like, in fact, and I feel like it's a little bit of an older generation that shares that. When I first started speaking and things like that, someone told me, like, I don't agree with it. Like, work is supposed to feel like work. Like, really? No, like, we spend a third of our adult awake life at work. We might as well find ways to enjoy it. And like I said before, our audience is this. One of the things that I've been playing with or exploring more recently that I think is resonating with people is that if you're like, hey, I just want to be that serious professional, the most you're really going to aspire to is like meh. Like meh in terms of results, but then meh in terms of like your enjoyment of work as well. Unless you are Steve Jobs. So Steve Jobs kind of notoriously anti-humor, etc. There are a few like standout people. Isaac Newton wasn't that funny of a person, etc. Like, so there are a few standouts. Unless you are Isaac Newton or Steve Jobs, right? Unless you're so good, you can actually overcome people not liking working with you, or people finding you boring, or people finding you too dry to talk to, or too serious, or too intense. Unless you're so good, you're going to overcome that. Why not learn this skill of humor, learn how to bring it into your place, and use it as a competitive advantage? Because if you want to stand out from people, imagine you have two people that are pretty kind of similar in terms of skill set. One of them is really enjoyable. You enjoy conversations with them. You have fun. You go to a meeting with them. You know you're going to laugh and smile. And the other one is about exciting as a brick wall. Which person are you going to give the opportunity to? Research shows it's the person that's more interesting, right? There's research that shows people who use and have a good sense of humor at work are seen as better leaders and are given more opportunities. Now, the key in all of this is how to do it well, right? Because I can say this because you could be like, oh, but because a person that's kind of like, but I'm not very funny, so I'm just going to avoid humor completely is like, it's the same person that would potentially theoretically say, oh, I misspoke once when I was like 3. So I'm never going to talk again and just send you written emails. Doesn't make sense.
Yeah. Well, this was super educational. I loved it because I was teaching at like at my level to what I knew of, because I was naturally funny. You know, I was the ugly sister. I had to learn it. And my dad was a clown, and he had the pun humor. So I grew up rolling my eyes. But then when I got older, I realized my dad was actually like clown with puns. And I realized, oh, I went into clowning because I kind of like to make people like a little bit uncomfortable. That like, oh, that brings me joy for some weird, sick reason. And now I just think of life without humor, my God, kill me now. It sounds horrible. So how can people, how can they join your programs? You must have them virtually, or are you coming to a Europe tour soon?
So we are, we've got things virtually. I'm trying to think, we're in Europe probably potentially in the summer next year. So we'll do maybe a little bit of a tour while there, but essentially our website, humorthatworks.com, has a bunch of free resources on it. So a ton of, free blog posts. I do a weekly newsletter called The Funny Thing About That, that people can kind of subscribe to completely for free. We've got a free humor assessment on our website. So you can take that and learn about which one of the 7 personas is your primary persona, and learn a little bit about the pros and cons of it. And then you can learn about the other personas as well. Also on our website, we have the information about our coaching programs and other things that all exist there. But humorthatworks.com is a great kind of starting point. And then if you really like my nerdy humor and you want some of those puns and things like that periodically, you can follow me on all social media at Drew Tarvin.
Drew Tarvin. I made the silly joke. I don't know if you saw it on LinkedIn, but when you do like Drew Tarvin, it looks like Dr. Tarvin. So your name is Dr. Tarvin.
Yeah. My brother has a PhD, and he like sometimes jokes about it. And like, I've had doctor in my name since I was born. So I don't know what you're feeling so good about. Dr.
I don't know what you're feeling so good about. Well, I watched your TEDx with you and your brother, and I've never seen a TEDx with 2 humans, let alone 2 brothers. And it was delightful because you guys obviously play off each other's differences, and it showed that both humors, I remember that humors was like how to describe people's personas back in the past. Like you'd have dark, I don't know.
Yeah, it was like a health related thing. It was like mood and stuff like that. The 4 humors is part of the body. Humor has gone through an interesting evolution of words, or like in terms of meanings. But I hope now what people are taking away from this is that to me, that humor is more broad than comedy. But this humor it's less about making, say, your work funny, but more about making it more fun. And that's what I love about what you're preaching and talking about, is that it doesn't have to be this specific. Like you can learn what a comic triple is. You can learn setup and punchline. You can learn those things if you want, but there's also plenty of other ways just to have a little bit more fun. And if you do that, you're also going to get better results.
Hallelujah. Great. We'll finish on the last words of Lenny Ravitch. He's my mentor. He's a funny guy, and he's a Gestalt therapist, and he combined the 2 to make people's lives happier and healthier. And I think they really go hand in hand. So we have an interview with him on Wednesday at 10 a.m. over there in Israel, and over here at 9 in Barcelona. And in just 25 minutes, I'm going to be talking to Nigel Resner about bold comedy, a little different style than yours. So get ready.
Love it.
Thank you so much, Mr. Andrew. Thank you. I appreciate your time.
Thank you, Jessica.
Bye.